the operating rules of the House sounds pretty boring, but what we found with fair districts is that that's what held us back with our main mission, which we have not abandoned, and it will be continuing and are continuing on, which is redistricting reform and an independent citizens commission. And what we found when we did the research was also that other bipartisan solutions were also being affected by that. And that the legislative process really makes a difference. And the problem is in the rules, and there is a fix, and we had an ask. We'll talk about what we got and what the next steps are. For years, we have been trying for redistricting reform, and our bills, which to change to have an independent citizens commission requires a constitutional amendment, which means it needs to be passed as a bill, both in the House and the Senate, 2 consecutive sessions, exactly the same bill, no amendments the second time around. And we had incredible bipartisan co-sponsorship and support for these bills, yet they went nowhere. 2017, when I came in, the 110 House co-sponsors of our bill, that was the most co-sponsors of any, and it's more than half of the House. Yet it was squashed by either being gutted and replaced in committee or simply torpedoed. And the next 2 sessions, 19 to 20 and 21 to 22, again, we had bipartisan co-sponsorships. We had bipartisan prime sponsors on these bills, yet there was no action. So what we want to talk about is that it was a surprise to us, I guess, because we thought that the constituents and the voters and Pennsylvanians did have a voice. We went out to municipalities and to counties and got them to adopt a resolution saying that they support an independent citizens commission. And we got 389 governing bodies. That was 23 counties. It was as many Republican majority municipalities as well as Democrats and in the counties. And when you looked at how many people these counties and municipalities represented, it was more than 70% of the state population. We're doing pretty good. They got to be listening to us, right? We had lots of in-person and Zoom visits with our legislators. We were very good at organizing those. We had lots of public comments through news articles and letters to the editors. And we even, not 1 year, but 2 years, had a poll through Franklin and Marshall that said not only, and it was split up with Democrats and Republicans and other, the majority of them supported redistricting reform and supported an independent commission. So why did we never get a floor vote in the House or the Senate for all those years? And then we started researching and found that there were all these other issues that Pennsylvanians care about that also were not getting anywhere. So if you look down through this list, I'm sure there's a number of them that are of interest to you that oftentimes get introduced every year but go nowhere either in one chamber, the Senate or the House, or the other. Or one chamber might pass it and it does nothing in the other chamber. But these are all extremely important issues. And all of a sudden, it's because of the rules. So let's look at the legislative process very quickly. And I'm sorry for, if I'm repeating something that you all are very familiar with. But first, there's an idea and a bill gets drafted and it goes to the first chamber. That's either the House or the Senate. And it goes to a committee. Doesn't have to have a hearing. The committee majority chair is in total control of whether that bill has anything that happens to it or not. Then, if it comes out of committee, there is possibly a floor debate, but that is up to the top 2 leaders in either the House or the Senate. They can ignore it, or they could bring it forward. And each bill, once it comes to the floor, must be considered on 3 separate days before it goes to final vote. If it passes the first chamber, then it goes to the other. So if it passes the House, it goes to the Senate. And the same process is repeated. The committee chair has total control over whether there are hearings or not, whether the bill even gets scheduled for deliberation and a vote. And again, if it does come out the floor to the other chamber's floor, then it is the two top leaders that decide whether it comes out or not, if there's going to be a debate, and whether it gets through all three or not. And of course, if it gets through, you got the governor who either passes it on to law or vetoes it. But in reality, what happens is all of those three that I mentioned, any one of those six can single-handedly block any bill at any time through this process, regardless of how much legislative support there is, regardless of public support. And it is, if the bill, let's say, starts in the House committee chair can absolutely block it. If he or she moves it forward, then it's the House majority leader and the Speaker of the House that can either block it or move it forward. Now, keep in mind that each of the House representatives only represents less than 0.5% of the population of Pennsylvania, yet they have this much power. In the Senate, it's the same thing. As I mentioned, the majority chair has total control over whether it moves or doesn't, whether it gets amended, whether it gets gutted and replaced. And then if it does come out and reported to the floor, it's the majority leader and the Senate president. Our Senate districts are a little larger, so each one still just represents 2% of the population, yet they have all this control. So there are some rules in the House that looks like we can keep things moving along. If we have a committee chair that is not moving a bill in the House, we have House Rule 53, where we can discharge this bill from committee. You have to wait until the bill has been in committee for 15 legislative days, and they don't have that many legislative days. So it averages 15 legislative days, about 3 months over that 2-year session. So that's a long time. So a member presents a resolution saying, I want to discharge this. And then they must obtain 25 signatures. And once it's placed on the calendar, it will be placed on the calendar once they have those 25 signatures. Any one of those 25 can then call up the resolution for a vote, because the resolution still has to be approved by the full House, by the majority of members that are elected, or they don't call it up. So what happens? Well, during this time that they're getting 25 signatures and it's getting on the calendar and somebody calls it up, a committee can report the bill out to the House, but can re-refer it to another committee. And if that's the case, the 15-day clock resets and it's another 3 months. Or the bill can be amended so that it is no longer desirable, or a gut and replace, as we call it. And my example is that it breaks another rule, because there shall be no bill that's amended that changes its original purpose. It's in our Constitution, but they have done it on more than one occasion. And the example is House Bill 717, which was to simply raise the age of when a person can obtain an assault weapon, and it is from 18 to 21. They must have had enough votes to move it in the House, because what happened was the Judiciary Committee, before they reported it out, actually gutted and replaced it to a completely different purpose from the original intent, which was to say that you could have a concealed carry permit, concealed carry without a permit, which had already been vetoed by the governor. But this is what they do. Another good one that sounds good in the rules that have been there is the consideration of the first consideration of bills. I mentioned there are 3 considerations. So when a bill comes out of committee, it automatically goes to first consideration and it goes to the table. This gives lawmakers and the public some time to get familiar with the bill, and if the bill has been amended in the committee, what does that amendment say? But it can't just stay there. Sounds good. After 15 legislative days on the table, at first consideration, it has to either move onto the active calendar or it's going to that's what they do. They just move it onto the calendar and it's ready for second consideration. So what do? Here's House Bill 47. On the 15th legislative day, now there's the active calendar, and that's what they follow for what their voting is. If they don't want to do it, they can put it on the table. So that's for later. We're tabling it. Okay. So in House Bill 47, what they did was had first consideration on January 27th. They removed it from the table on April 7th, which happens to be exactly 15 legislative days later. They lay it back on the table, and it can stay on that table to the end of the session and be completely ignored. And that's what they have done often. Another good rule, it sounds like a good rule, is House Rule 71, which means if a bill is on the calendar, it can't just stay on the calendar without any action for more than 15 days. Otherwise, it's going to be recommitted back to the committee. So what do? And when I say common practice, I have seen bill histories, I can't tell you how many, that they do this. On the 15th day, it's on the calendar. It can't stay there any longer without going to committee. So in one breath, they put it on the table, take it off the calendar, and then put it back on the calendar, which starts the 15-day legislative clock. So I call this ping-ponging, and they do it over and over again. And here we go. Here's one that was done in judiciary. And if you notice, these dates, after it came out of first consideration and it can't stay on the calendar, they lay it on the table and they take it off the table back on the calendar. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it was laid on the calendar, and in the calendar it can stay there forever. So there are rules that sound good, but they manipulate them, and what I consider they abuse them. There is another rule that says a special order of business. If there's a bill that's on the table that's not coming up for a vote, then you can move for a special order of business and bring that to a vote. That motion must be approved by a majority of the members of the vote. But if the bill is awaiting second consideration, remember there are 3 considerations. The second consideration is the only time House member can amend the bill. And there are rules for how long the amendment process needs to take and get in front of House members to be considered on second consideration. And there's no limit to make sure that there is time for that amendment. And so in reviewing transcripts of House back 13, 16 years, this has not been used because there are these loopholes that are involved. So once fair districts finally saw this was happening, what did they want? What are they asking for? What would give Pennsylvania's more representation in the House? And what fair districts said, and is still saying, is that bills that have bipartisan support must be guaranteed a vote in committee. And if it comes out of committee and it has that bipartisan support, it must be guaranteed a vote on the chamber floor. And if it goes through that chamber to the other chamber, it can't just be ignored. That bill has to be given consideration and a vote in the other chamber. So we did get new House rules. So what did we get? Well, the discharge resolution that I talked about first did change a little bit. It requires bipartisan support in that instead of just needing 25 signatures, it needs 25 signatures from both parties. It did improve by saying if it's re-referred to another committee, the discharge resolution is still valid and we don't start that 15-day clock again. The motion for a special order of business where we can pull a bill off the table and get it in front of the House was also changed so that if it's a bill that's on second consideration, there is so much time allotted before it will actually get that consideration after the special order of business, so that there is time for members to write and file amendments so they can be brought to the House during second consideration to be voted on. It also says if the bill is awaiting third consideration where there is no amendments and the special order of business is successful with a majority vote, then third consideration and final vote happens on that day. So that is an advantage. So the House rules that we really didn't get, this is the same language as I said 2 slides ago. The bills demonstrated with bipartisan support is guaranteed a vote in committee. Well, they're not. They must use the discharge resolution. And that's not a vote in committee, because a vote in committee also means that the bill needs to be deliberated so we can hear from the members. And we as constituents can understand where those members are coming from, as well as to see a vote. But if the discharge resolution comes out, there is no vote and there is no deliberation in committee. So we said if it comes out, even if the discharge resolution is successful, then we want to make sure there's a guaranteed vote in the chamber floor. And that is not the case. We must use the special order, and that has to be approved by the majority member. And so again, it can still be buried by all those ping-ponging back and forth between the table and the calendar. And so a special order of business might be able to get it out, but it doesn't guarantee a vote. It doesn't guarantee deliberation. So we as constituents can hear where our representatives stand. And finally, if it passes one chamber, it has to be given consideration in the second chamber. I don't think I have it in my slides because I just finished it this morning. For fair districts is that more than half of the bills that pass one chamber, either the House or the Senate, it doesn't come out of the other chamber. And of those bills that go to one chamber, it gets stuck in the next one. Half of those bills had a unanimous vote out of that first chamber, but it can be ignored by the other chamber. And that's what we did not want. And that is not what we got. Other disappointments is that in the rules itself, we were asking that the rules resolution be available to lawmakers and to the public for 24 hours before they were voted on. And that vote took place March 1st, just 2 weeks ago. That did not occur. I think the lawmakers saw it maybe 24 hours before, but it was certainly not available to the public. And they did the same type of maneuver that the Republicans have been using for at least three sessions, which was they first, because they have the majority vote, they first adopt a resolution. This is crazy. They first adopt a resolution that says, when we bring up the rules resolution, you can't amend it. So they do that one first. Hope there's a lot of people out there shaking their heads. And this time they did the same thing. They adopted a rule that says you cannot amend the rules resolution. And so it got adopted and is very contentious. The other things that we did not get is we had asked that every member of the House be given the opportunity to designate a priority bill. This bill that House member designates means it has to come out of committee and it has to be considered on the floor. Every one of the elected officials, every one that we have elected as constituents, has an opportunity to move a bill forward and not let it get stuck by those 6 majority leaders that we talked about before. The other disappointment is that the time between a bill gets amended and the final vote used to be for more than 10 years, you had to have 24 hours for the lawmaker to understand the amendment and what it did to the underlying bill before a final vote and passage on to the next chamber. It was reduced in 2019 to 12 hours, and in this rules, it's reduced to 3 hours. So a bill can be amended, and in 3 hours, it goes to final vote. Another thing that happens is that was a change in 2021, just 2 years ago, that amendments, and this is a tricky one, amendments can be tabled. So we're not going to vote on it today. It's not on the calendar anymore. We're going to put it on the table. But the bill that the amendment is attached to still stays active. And even the nationally recognized Mason's manual rules say that that's just a way of disposing an amendment and not having debate on it. That was done in 2021 for that 2-year session that just ended. And that is still in the House resolutions today. And another thing is somebody who has done a lot of research on both the House sessions, but in particular the committee meetings, is that the committee hearings will no longer have transcripts. Unless a House member says, I want a transcript and I know I got to pay for it. I have listened to lots of committee videos, and I can tell you that when I'm searching for particular issues and trying to gain an understanding of things, it's the written transcript where I can do searches on certain words that are very valuable to all of us that are trying to understand what's going on rather than sitting and listening to hours and hours of committee meetings. There were some other positive changes. They did say that for a bill coming out of the House that is a constitutional amendment, it can only contain one amendment. In the Senate, just this term, they have a bill that has 3 constitutional amendments in it. So lawmakers are not able to vote on individual amendments. They have to vote yay or nay for all 3 at once. The other positive is that if there is a constitutional amendment in a bill before it has second consideration, there must be a hearing. And that also is as a result of constitutional amendments that are being pushed forward very quickly without any sort of hearing, expert testimony, understanding by the lawmakers or us constituents as to the pros and cons of this constitutional amendment. There was a temporary rule last session because of COVID that committee membership could participate remotely, kind of like what we're doing now. And they could also remotely vote as well, designated voting. And now that is in the permanent rules. It was in temporary rules, which went away, but it has been put in the permanent rules, which is a good thing. When you're talking about hearings in the committee, many times those hearings testifiers were picked solely by the majority chair of the committee, and it only showed one side of the story. So now with the new rules, the minority leader can invite at least one testifier for the hearing. So that is a step forward. As far as redistricting is concerned, you may or may not know that in years past, the congressional redistricting bill comes out of the General Assembly, but in recent years, it's come out as a bill that we call a shell bill. It does not define the districts. It says District 1 will consist of a portion of the Commonwealth. District 2 will be a portion of the Commonwealth. And they actually feel and have succeeded in going through the first 2 considerations of the 3 considerations needed with no information. And then all of a sudden, the information comes out and there's a map. Everybody is scrambling, but typically within hours of having that information, the vote comes up, and that will no longer happen because if you're going to put out a bill, it has to have a map, which means it has to have districts that are defined. Now, rules can still be amended, either in the House or the Senate. They write up a resolution that changes the rule. It's referred to the Rules Committee, of which there's one in the House and the Senate, and the chair of the committee, which is the majority leader of that chamber, schedules a vote or not. If it's reported out of committee, the majority leader determines if the House will vote or not. It's kind of the same, the 3 people in that chamber, House or Senate, has complete control over whether we look at the resolution or not. Now, because it's just changing the rules in that chamber and not affecting anything in the others, it doesn't need 3 considerations, and it isn't approved by the other chamber. But here's what happens. I've done the research back 16 years to 2007. That was the last time there was a real rules reform commission that was formed and rules were changed. In the House, 79 proposed rules resolutions, both authored by Democrats and Republicans. Only one of 79 was approved by the House and adopted. The other 78 never came out of rules. And in the Senate, it is the same. In those 16 years, there were 32 rules resolutions to change the rules authored by both parties, but only one was approved by the Senate and adopted, and 31 basically were ignored. 78 never came out of committee, and 31 never came out of committee. So our next steps is that we've had the House rules since just March 1st, so they're still pretty fresh to us. So Fair Districts is preparing a response to legislators, the pros and cons of the changes, as I have pointed out here. We're also preparing a message that will be distributed to our supporters, anybody who has signed up for the Fix Harrisburg petition or is part of Fair Districts. Messages will go out talking about it, and there is we're going to be researching and keeping track of, that's what the binoculars are there for. What are the bills with bipartisan support in the House and in the Senate, and are they moving or not? So that we can let people know, and we can let legislators know, and we can let their constituents say, hey, we don't have the bipartisan support that we were looking for. It's not the bipartisan support that people were asking for in the listening sessions that Representative Rozzi had. So what's going on? In the Senate, during the first session day, they did adopt rules. And Senator Muth stood up and had her own rules resolution, which had very positive changes. And after she was done speaking about the benefits of the changes, the Majority Leader Pittman simply moved to move Senate Resolution 7 to the Rules Committee. Debate was done, they voted, and it went, and that's where it sits. We're still preparing our Fair Districts, what approach it is that we want for rules changes, but it's going to be important, and what we're going to be doing that's so important is that these legislators need to know, as boring as rules are, that we understand the importance and we understand how it's blocking bipartisan bills that are not getting a vote. And we're going to keep reminding them. And so we hope that you will stay connected. If you have the bandwidth with both Fair Districts, but in particular, Fix Harrisburg, so that when this information comes out, you know what needs to be communicated to your senator and your representative. Here is a link to Fix Harrisburg. It's a link to a wonderful document called Dysfunction by Design, a white paper that was researched by us at Fair Districts that really very concisely talks about the bipartisan solutions that are extremely important that aren't getting consideration and why. That document, Dysfunction by Design, has actually been delivered to every 2053, but we're down by a couple right now, lawmakers. So they have a copy, a physical copy of it, and you can look at it online there.